It's February 24th, 1859, and Teresa Sickles, wife of up-and-coming freshman Congressman from New York, Daniel Sickles, and one of the most respected hostesses in the city, is hosting the party of the year at her ritzy home just steps from the White House. It's a who's who of Washington, with esteemed guests including the U.S. Attorney, members of Congress, and cabinet members in attendance. Tonight's event was in honor of Madam James Gordon Bennett, wife of the publisher of the New York Herald, which was a very powerful paper at the time. As the night wore on, drinks and conversation were flowing, and partygoers were not ready for it to end. So Teresa and the rest of the guests loaded up into carriages and set off for the Willard Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue to dance and keep the good vibes going. Unbeknownst to Teresa, this night would go down in history, not because of her skills as a hostess, but because of an anonymous letter to her husband that would eventually lead to a public murder and an even more public trial. This is the story of the murder of Philip Barton Key II, the son of the author of the Star Spangled Banner.
She's Sarah.
She's Harley.
And we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress.
Teresa DuPont Baggioli was born in New York City in 1836, daughter of famed Italian singer Antonio Baggioli and Maria Cook. Her father, a musician and talented vocal coach, was the conductor of the Italian opera in 1832. Antonio met his wife Maria, who also went by Eliza, while the Italian opera company was touring in New York. She was the adopted daughter of Lorenzo DuPont, though there's speculation that she may have actually been his biological daughter with another woman. Lorenzo was a celebrated music teacher who worked with this sort of famous musician you might have heard of, Mozart.
Oh, yeah, no, I've heard of him.
As his librettist. One of his credits includes The Marriage of Figaro, which you're hearing a clip from right now. We are big fans of the public domain here at Crime in Congress. He is also credited with introducing Italian opera to America, wild, and was the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia University.
I like how, not Broadway, obviously, but once again, we have to have some sort of theater reference in there.
Of course, and it keeps coming. When Antonio's company was done with its New York City stops and headed to Havana, Cuba for the next leg of their tour, Antonio didn't join them. He had fallen in love with Maria. Kind of seems like a rude thing to do in the middle of a tour for an opera you conduct, but what do I know? They began courting and were married in 1834. Teresa was born 2 years later, when Maria was only 17. And before you say, it was of the times, blah, 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 no. An article by Shannon Withicombe, that I'll link in the show notes, said that the average age women married in the 1830s was 20. Meaning giving birth at 17 was not the norm.
Huh, wait, that's so interesting. I don't think I realized that the average age was 20 back then.
I think it's because a lot of the stories we hear are of like people who were wealthy and in power and could marry whoever they wanted.
And were pervs?
Yeah, pretty much. Pervs in Congress, let's go.
new podcast title name.
Right. From birth, Teresa was immersed in the world of arts, from music to language, and was actually fluent in 5 different languages. Her household consisted of Lorenzo DuPont, the Mozart-connected grandfather, his 4 children, including Teresa's mother, Maria, and all of their children. She was growing up in a multicultural household where academic and musical excellence was the norm. She was worldly educated and had some of the best scholars and artists in history influencing her from an early age. It was her family's reputation for perfection that would bring Teresa and Daniel Sickles together. Daniel Edgar Sickles was born in 1819 in New York City to parents Susan Marsh Sickles and George Garrett Sickles. Like Teresa, he came from a well-off family, with his father working as a real estate investor, though his family's wealth would fluctuate over time. Some sources will report that Daniel was born in 1825, but that is incorrect. He would later try to fib a little on his age, and you'll see a likely reason why in a second. His father and mother, who were described as domineering and over-attentive by author Krista Rose, who wrote the book most of this episode is based off of, want to give him his credit, titled Star Spangled Scandal, Sex, Murder, and the Trial That Changed America.
I love that name.
Right? Great title. There isn't too much that is known definitively about Daniel Sickles' childhood and teen years. Daniel was briefly sent to Glen Falls Academy, a New York boarding school, but that didn't last long. He decided not to go home, though. Sounds kind of like a well-off kid with strict parents trying to do something different, a la Lorelai Gilmore. He began working in the printing trade as an apprentice, otherwise known as a printer's devil. Through this job, Sickles developed an interest in politics and world affairs. He spent his days printing papers and would regale himself in the tales of triumph and scandal from Britain to New York. He decided he wanted to be a part of this new world. His first foray into the world of politics would come in 1835, when a 16-year-old Sickles would rally in support of Martin Van Buren's presidential bid. Sickles would briefly move back in with his parents. It wasn't exactly home, as they had purchased a farm in New Jersey and relocated, but rural life disagreed with Sickles, and he set off for Philadelphia. Despite underestimating the cost of the trip and showing up in the city without the means to secure housing, a boarding house would end up welcoming him anyway. Sickles rather quickly found a job at a local magazine, the Barton Gentleman's Magazine. That magazine would eventually hire Edgar Allan Poe as its editor.
Wait, so many famous characters in this story.
It's insane.
Also, I kind of like how Sickles is just a boy with a dream in New York City.
He's just getting on a train. Actually, were trains invented at this time?
Yeah, right?
Okay. I'm sure they were.
I'm sure they were.
You know what? I'm going to leave that in so that everyone can know how much we have to Google things to make these episodes work.
Everyone knows we don't know when trains were invented.
It's like, no one does. Like his time at boarding school, Sickles' Pennsylvania era didn't last very long. His parents goaded him back to New York with plans to attend college, on their dime, of course. To prepare for his eventual enrollment at NYU, which at the time was called the University of the City of New York, Sickles went to live at the DuPonts in 1838. He might have been from a wealthy family, but he was new money. Stepping into the DuPont household was like stepping into an entirely different world, just like he had previously when working as a printer's devil. Now, here's where things get a little confusing. Lorenzo DuPont had a son also named Lorenzo DuPont, and they lived together. So some sources get the two confused. From what I can tell, Sickles may have briefly lived with the elder Lorenzo, but he would unfortunately pass away in 1838, leaving Lorenzo the younger as the new head of household. It's possible, however, that Sickles and the elder Lorenzo never overlapped, because we don't have an exact date that he arrived. Lorenzo the younger, I'm going to call him Little Lorenzo, was a professor at NYU and helped Dan get a scholarship to the university. While Dan was preparing for college, he was going to study law, Teresa, niece of Little Lorenzo, was studying too. But since she was only about 3 years old, there wasn't much of an overlap in what they were learning.
Oh, good. So this is a good start to a long-term healthy relationship, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. He was learning law, she was learning ABCs. What could go wrong? Sickles would only end up staying with the DuPonts for about a year. His time at NYU wasn't much longer. Little Lorenzo would die prematurely in 1840, and that would be the end of Sickles' time at the school. He continued his pursuit of a career in law by studying under a prominent New York attorney, passed the bar, and opened his own practice on 79 Nassau Street. There are conflicting dates as to when this happened, but it was sometime in the 1840s. He quickly gained a reputation for his superior public speaking skills, quick wit, and astronomical fees. He began rubbing elbows with the Wigwam, which was this powerful, elite political machine that basically ran New York's elections. He also started a paper called The Sober Second Thought, kind of digging the name.
Great name.
Which was a paper in support of James Polk's presidency. But his reputation as a skilled lawyer and rising figure in state politics was not the only one he was building. Sickles had a girlfriend named Fanny White who ran 161 Mercer Street, which was basically a high-end brothel.
Oh.
She was enormously successful and kind of treated Sickles like her sugar baby, treating him with nice suits and meals and more.
Wait, pop off, Fanny.
Right? I didn't dig too much into Fanny's history, so if there are some skeletons there, don't come for me. But she seems like kind of a badass. Women were not allowed to drink in saloons at the time, but that didn't bother Fanny. One night on a date with Sickles, she dressed up like a man and the two drank their way through the city. Krista Rose said of Fanny, she had assumed so much of a man's role in the 1840s, financially independent, in charge of her personal life, that slipping on a man's clothes seemed minor.
Yeah, love her. Love her.
Right? It didn't work, though, and they spent the night in jail.
Oh. You know what? I'm not actually surprised by that, I don't think.
Yeah, no. In 1846, at the age of 27, Sickles achieved a decade-long dream and was elected to the New York Assembly. He ran as a Democrat and described himself as a tough Democrat, a fighting one, a Tammany Hall Democrat. Tammany Hall was the political machine in New York at the time. From what I read, it kind of seems like the modern-day equivalent of the DNC. This was his first taste of real power, and it only made him thirst for more. But Sickles was not a man easily swayed by the opinions of others. It's a trait that almost certainly contributed to his eventual political successes and his downfalls. Much to the chagrin of his colleagues, Sickles continued dating Fanny very publicly, even having her visit at the state capitol.
Fabulous.
It was certainly a bit scandalous for a member of the New York legislature to be openly involved with a madam. There was an incident with the sergeant at arms during one of her visits to see Sickles, but people also didn't really want to admit that they recognized her because it would raise some questions about why a married man would be familiar with a madam.
Wait, that's so great.
That wasn't the only scandal Sickles was courting either. James Hessler, a licensed Gettysburg battlefield guide, writes he was indicted for obtaining money under false pretenses, was almost prosecuted for appropriating funds from another man, was accused of pocketing money that had been raised for a political pamphlet, stealing money from the post office, and charged with improperly retaining a mortgage that he had pledged as collateral on a loan. Hessler also reported that Dan was linked to stories about ballot tampering and theft, bringing in illegal voters from other districts, and brawls. He was once thrown down a flight of stairs at a campaign rally. He also, and this is a rumor, may have offered Fanny's services for favors.
Okay. A lot of charges.
Yes. Certainly an interesting rap sheet. To say the least.
Definitely.
I think it's also safe to say that his decision-making was questionable. Whether these scandals contributed to him losing a bid for state senate after only serving in the New York Assembly for 1 year, I don't know. But honestly, I tend to think not, given the success that was just around the horizon for him. Presumably returning to practice law after being out of the legislature, his love affair with Fanny, I don't really know how committed they were. I think it was more Maddie Healy than Joe Alwyn.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you. It would come to a rather abrupt end in 1851 when Daniel reconnected with the now much older Teresa.
How much older?
Not enough.
Okay.
Sickles was smitten with the smart, talented, and beautiful Teresa, and the two quickly fell in love. Her parents did not approve, and they had a valid reason. Teresa was 16, and Daniel was 33.
Oh, so just a little over double her age.
Yeah, disgusting. Undeterred by her family's disapproval, because, she's 16, so of course she didn't care, the couple married in a secret ceremony on September 27th, 1852. Can you see why Daniel might have wanted to fib a little on the year he was born?
Yeah, I can.
I don't know why, but this detail really stuck with me, and I had to bring it up. Teresa was still in Catholic boarding school when they were married. That makes my skin crawl, and I just can't get it out of my head.
Ew.
33-year-old politicians have no business marrying high schoolers. Like, what in the Matt Gates is going on here? It's insane.
That reminds me, Colin Jost was at White House Correspondents' Dinner last night.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you saw his speech, but part of it was, we're all here tonight for nerd prom. And he said, well, Matt Gates is at regular prom.
I hadn't seen that yet.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. But even though I find this whole situation gross, I have to move on because her family eventually did. Refusing to accept that their daughter was wed in secret, and recognizing that at this point they lost the battle, her parents got on board with the marriage, and they were celebrated with a formal wedding ceremony conducted by the Catholic Archbishop. Some sources say that the ceremony happened 10 days later, others say 6 months later, but I think I have an explanation for that discrepancy too. The couple's first and only child, Laura Buchanan Sickles, was born 1853. Conveniently, there's no official birth date that can be found for her. But that kind of gives credence to this idea that Teresa was pregnant at one or both of her wedding ceremonies.
Oh, wow. So I see why there would be incentive to maybe tweak those dates.
Exactly. That's my best theory as to why the timeline's messy. I saw in a few different places that Laura was born 7 months after they were married, which makes me think Teresa was probably pregnant in September when they were first married. I'll get to it in a minute, but Dan was in England by the fall of 1853, and Laura was definitely born before he left. So a spring baby makes the most sense. The pregnancy also could have been the reason why the two decided to get married in secret in the first place.
Right. I don't love this Dan guy.
No, and he only gets worse. As you've already seen, a lot of the details I have from the Sickles' lives, especially before Dan was in Congress, have conflicting timelines. I went with the dates that made the most sense based on sure things like presidential elections, but we're dealing with 1800s record keeping, which was not the best. If you do any of your own research about Teresa and Dan, you might see different dates. We're doing our best. Sickles' career and personal life were on the up and up. After a decade of bouncing between schools and cities and jobs, dating madams and getting into brawls, he had a beautiful, intelligent wife from a respected family, a daughter on the way, and a resume that included the state legislature and a successful law career. But Sickles was about to hit yet another career milestone. That year, 1853, he was appointed as corporation attorney for the city of New York, a pretty big deal. In this position, he is credited for acquiring the land for, get this, Central Park. But once again, this position was just a pit stop on his way to bigger and better things, and he stayed only a few months. It was long enough to make a lasting effect on American culture, though. I can't even really wrap my head around all the ways his family was connected to people and historical events. Like, kind of insane.
Yeah, that is so wild. Central Park.
Yeah. He, takes credit for Central Park. It's, one of the things he's proud of stuff in his career.
I mean,
Insane.
I guess I would be proud of that, too.
I mean, I would have retired after that.
Yeah, we're done.
Yeah, it's not going to get better. And it doesn't get better, trust me. One of the historic people that Dan was connected with was James Buchanan, who in 1853 was just one term away from the presidency and had just been tapped as the new minister to London. He was in need of a smart, hardworking man with political savvy to serve as his secretary of legation. A legation is a diplomatic office that is a step below an embassy. Daniel Sickles' name quickly rose to the top of the list. Sickles jumped at the opportunity to work for one of his political idols. Buchanan was Secretary of State for James Polk and had a long political resume spanning Sickles' entire life. It was a dream come true. Teresa, on the other hand, was less than thrilled. In addition to the job being a huge pay cut, after learning it paid a $2,500 salary, about 15 times less than he was currently making,
Whoa.
He said, quote, "Why, bless you, my dear fellow, that would hardly pay for my wine and cigars." Teresa was also not thrilled about being an ocean apart from her husband while raising a newborn who was too young at the time to make the trip to London.
Right. Well, she's also 17, so a lot to take in.
17-year-old me could never, I could barely handle my anatomy class.
Yeah.
This is just a whole other ballgame. Teresa wrote in a letter to Dan, "I want to be with you as much as possible. I wish to be near and with you. I hate the idea of your going away without me, and I know that I would not have you if it were in my power. You know what is best, and I shall act as you with me to however much I may dislike it. God only knows how I can get along without you."
Oh, so she really is genuinely in love with this man.
I really think she was. Sickles left on August 20th, 1853, and immediately began counting down the days until his wife and newborn daughter could meet him. Supposedly. There are also rumors that he took Fanny with him on this trip until Teresa got there, even introducing her to the Queen. But I'm not convinced that there's any truth to that.
Okay, yeah, interesting. That would definitely be a scandal if it was.
Yeah, and I mean, she was a business owner. She had more to do than follow Dan overseas. But I mean, crazier things have happened.
So true. She has business to attend to.
Exactly. Fortunately for Teresa, Laura, and Dan, the separation wouldn't be long. By spring, the three were reunited, and for Teresa at least, the wait proved worth it. No longer the wife of a mere New York City lawyer, Teresa Sickles was in the highest of high society, and it fit like a glove. She was a fantastic hostess and charmed everyone she met. Her evenings were spent at Buckingham Palace balls and at ornate meals with the Mayor of London. She had tea with the Queen. On the weekends, she traveled throughout Europe with only the best of company. Teresa was no longer eclipsed by her husband's shadow, at least not in her social life. She was a fixture in her own right and was finally getting a little bit of the recognition she deserved. But it wasn't on her terms. She missed home, she missed having money, and never dreamed of a life in London.
Who was the Queen at this time?
Probably Elizabeth. I feel like there was probably an Elizabeth.
I feel like Elizabeth was the 1600s.
I feel like there's always a Queen Elizabeth.
No.
I've never watched The Crown.
There's not always a Queen Elizabeth.
Okay, well.
Anywho, I could also be wrong.
We may never know.
We'll
There's
never
no
know.
way to find out who the
Yeah.
Queen was at this time. So. Okay, maybe I should watch The Crown.
I don't think The Crown goes back this far, so we'll just never know.
Cool, okay. Dan had ambitions on American soil as well, and around 1855, the Sickles took the familiar trip back to New York City. I'm imagining that Teresa was probably excited and relieved. She's finally getting back home, back to her life, and she has this newfound confidence that she's bringing back with her. But whatever fantasies she had on the long boat ride back about what her family's future would hold in America likely failed to include the very events that would define their legacy for more than a century. Almost immediately after coming back to the States, Sickles once again launched a bid for state senate. This time, he won and served as a New York state senator from 1856 to 1857. But his big political break was just around the corner. Buchanan was well on his way to winning the presidency, and because of their cozy relationship during their time in the UK, Sickles was tapped as one of his top campaign officials. But Sickles had no interest in riding another man's coattails. Instead of seeking a cushy cabinet position, Sickles decided to launch his own bid for the House of Representatives as a Democrat. Both men were successful. President James Buchanan and Congressman Daniel Sickles were headed to Washington, D.C. Once again, Dan was altering the life he had promised Teresa. She endured London and the pitiful salary of a bureaucrat, was finally back in New York with her family. At best, she suffered through rumors of infidelity. At worst, she was forced to put up with it. But her quiet suffering was never going to be enough for Dan. He wanted more than the life of a New York lawyer and state politician. He wanted to make history in our nation's capital. He would, but for all the wrong reasons. At Buchanan's inaugural parade, described as the grandest in the history of Washington, the Sickles made their big debut. Amongst donors, lobbyists, dignitaries, politicians, reporters, and more, he twirled Teresa at the fanciest balls in the city, hobnobbed with the president, and reveled in power and privileges that his new position was already bringing him. It also meant people were already asking him for favors. While at the inaugural festivities, Dan was introduced to U.S. Attorney Philip Barton Key. The position of U.S. Attorney is appointed by the president, and Key knew two things. One, that he wanted to keep his job, and two, that Congressman Sickles had the president's ear. Key asked for assurances from Sickles that the president would reappoint him as U.S. Attorney, and Sickles gave it freely. That promise was upheld, but no good deed goes unpunished, and it wouldn't take long for Sickles to regret it. Now, who is Philip Barton Key II? Philip Barton Key II was born April 5th, 1818 in Georgetown, which at this time was its own city, I believe, and not part of D.C., to parents Mary Lloyd and Francis Scott Key, who, as I mentioned in the intro, was the author of the Star Spangled Banner. He's also been in the news again recently, kind of, for that bridge that collapsed, which was named after him.
Oh, yeah. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, but I think he probably prefers being remembered for the, iconic song.
Certainly not the bridge.
Philip was named after his dad's uncle, which is why he was a junior. His father, a poet, musician, lawyer, and permanent resident in American history books, left rather big shoes for him to fill, but he was up for the task. As a child, his family sent him to boarding school to ensure academic excellence. There isn't great record keeping about his younger years. We know that his father died when Barton was 25 years old and bestowed upon him his entire law library, with the hopes that Key would pursue a career in law. In addition to his father being a prominent attorney, Barton was also the nephew of Chief Justice Roger Taney. So law was the family business, and Barton lived up to the name. In 1846 or 1847, he was appointed by President James Polk to U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, a position his father actually held, when he was only 28 years old. Even by his father's standards, this was a huge accomplishment. He also found success in his family life. Philip met and fell in love with Ellen Swan, daughter of another Maryland attorney. Also, there are a couple different names here. Sometimes he goes by Burton, sometimes Philip, sometimes Key. So we're just going to mix it up, and y'all get to keep up.
Stay on your toes, you know?
Stay on your toes. Ellen was the love of Philip's life. They married in 1845 and had 4 children and had every intention of growing old together. But fate had different plans. After over a decade of marriage, Swan passed due to health complications. This left Philip in his late 30s with 4 children to take care of on his own and a gaping hole in his heart that he would never be able to refill. So, it's 1847, and Key decides to befriend freshman Congressman Sickles in hopes of, like I said, maintaining his job during the presidential transition. And to Sickles' credit, he followed through. He stepped in on Key's behalf, and Key was able to maintain his position as U.S. Attorney during the Buchanan administration. Of course, this likely meant he'd have to cash in a favor for Sickles at a later time, but especially in the 1800s, this was part and parcel of Washington. Key and Sickles had all of the ingredients for a mutually beneficial long-term friendship, and the two quickly began running in the same social circles. Like Sickles, Key had a reputation for being a bit of a ladies' man. Described as the most handsome man in Washington and Apollo in appearance, making him very popular with the widows and single ladies. He once said, "This is such an 1800s fuckboy energy that, quote, I only need 36 hours with any woman to make her do what I please."
Oh, goodbye.
But by 1858, he only had eyes for one woman. Her name? Teresa Sickles.
Oh, no.
This is where things start to get spicy, so buckle up. To quote Sickles' lawyer, "The wrong of a stranger may be borne with patience, but the perfidy of a friend becomes intolerable."
Oof.
At the start of the 35th Congress, the Sickles would take up residence in the Ewell House, number 14 Jackson Place, which is on Lafayette Square. Fun fact, this area was actually originally supposed to be part of the White House grounds, but Thomas Jefferson decided to use Pennsylvania Avenue as the dividing line, and what we know as Lafayette Square today became President's Park. It was renamed in 1824. The house had boasted many famous residents, including 2 senators, the Secretary of the Navy, and an Attorney General. And who would serve as the Sickles' real estate agent to secure this property? None other than Mr. Philip Barton Key.
Uh-oh.
This was no small expenditure either. Their lease was $3,000 a year, which is $114,200 today, or $9,500 a month.
Wow.
Right. Which was Sickles' entire salary as a congressman. But they were able to afford such luxuries because Dan maintained his law practice in New York, which meant that on top of his demanding schedule as a lawmaker, he was also traveling back and forth between D.C. and New York pretty often.
Presumably by train.
Teresa's schedule was similarly demanding. On Tuesdays, she hosted receptions. On Thursdays, she hosted dinners. She had a social obligation practically every evening, meaning she found herself without Dan to escort her, which makes sense. He was holding down 2 demanding jobs, and she had an engagement every single night. But Barton Key was more than happy to play escort for Teresa. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for widowers to accompany women to parties and the theater when their husbands were predisposed. And since Dan and Key were friends, it didn't raise any eyebrows in the beginning when the two began making the social rounds together. In the beginning, they would commute in carriages with other couples, but eventually it would be just the 2 of them. Then they were spotted riding horses together.
Oh,
I know.
Scandalous.
I know. Key was also spotted going in and out of the Sickles home at unseemly hours, even when it was known that Dan was not home.
Mm-mm.
Even when Teresa was accompanied by Dan to parties, Key had a knack for always just kind of showing up to the same events, as if he kind of knew she was going to be there and when she was going to be there. Needless to say, the rumor mill was swirling. Dan, for his part, seemed rather oblivious. When Dan heard that Stephen Beekman was making comments about Teresa and Barton's relationship, it was made clear that Beekman was no longer welcome in the Sickles home. It wasn't enough for Dan to just kick Beekman out of his house, though. He wanted to squash these rumors for good. He wrote to his friend Woolridge, who told Dan about the comments Beekman was making about Teresa and Key. Quote, "Will you please state in writing what communications you made concerning me, and also give your authority for making such communications?" Woolridge didn't quite tell Dan what he was wanting to hear. He wrote back, quote, "Marshall J. Bacon informed me on Tuesday afternoon, March 23rd, side note, we're in 1858 here. On Tuesday afternoon, March 23rd, that Mr. Beekman said that Miss Sickles and Mr. Key had been out riding on horseback 3 different times. During Mr. Sickles' last absence to the city of New York, they had stopped at a house on the road towards Bladensburg, and that Miss Sickles had a room there and remained for 1 hour and a half, and that he had no doubt there was intimacy between the two.
Oh no.
Bacon would confirm the story as well. However, he put his own little spin on the tale, saying that he heard the story from Woolridge, not the other way around, and that he didn't think there was any truth to it. So Beekman was saying things to either Woolridge or Bacon, who then told it to the other, kind of he said, she said.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Bacon admitted that the conversation took place, but he didn't actually seem to find Beekman credible, or at least didn't want to admit that to Sickles.
I see.
So then Sickles went back to Beekman, asking if he was responsible for these lies about his wife. Shockingly, Beekman caved. He wrote back, "I disavow that I was ever their author, and pronounce everything therein as a lie, and also the statement of Mr. Bacon that I was their author." I'm going to put a little spoiler here, but Beekman was not lying. So this was likely him just wanting to get out of a situation that was getting stickier and stickier by the day. He was also probably trying to get out of a duel. He wasn't about to die for these rumors. And it worked. I have always liked Mr. Key, thought him a man of honor. This thing shocked me when I first heard it. But after Beekman's apology, Sickles was ready to let the whole thing go. He was like, all right, clearly someone was making something up. It's over.
Mm-hmm.
Beekman and Bacon had their own issues to resolve, though. Apparently, they ran into each other at the Willards Hotel, and Beekman tried to cane him. Bacon avoided a public beating by promising to retract everything he had said in writing the next day, but that never happened. And to be fair, Bacon was almost certainly telling the truth. I want to take a step back and look at this from Teresa's perspective. She was a child when she married a man decades older than her. She quickly became pregnant, moved overseas, then back to New York, then to Washington, D.C., taking her away from her family, and all to support her husband's career. Once she did start to make a life for herself in Washington, D.C., her husband was pretty absent. She was the crown jewel of the social scene, but in her home life, she was practically ignored. Sickles wouldn't let her be jeweled, and she was getting fed up with it. And while all of this was going on, Dan had his own rumors of infidelity and affairs with women, including, the big one alleging that he took a madam to England while she was home with a newborn. And even if it's not true, I'm sure that would rattle your brain and make you feel insecure.
Yeah, totally. Also, she's what? How old now?
I mean, 19, 20?
Right.
Yeah, young. Then After all of this, she meets this handsome widower who is in just as much a position of power as her own husband, and who has more children who he cares for on his own, and yet somehow has all the time in the world for Teresa and makes her feel special and loved and seen. And remember, it's spring of 1858. Oh, here's her age, which means Teresa was only 22. Her frontal lobe's not even developed.
Yeah, think about the decisions you made when you were 22.
Exactly. I'm not excusing any of the behavior that comes next, but I feel for Teresa. It seems like all she really wanted was to be seen, and Key, who was 40, so still way too old to be with this young girl, handed that to her on a silver platter. She was manipulated, and I have a soft spot for her. Key and Teresa weren't idiots, though. They knew that the public was catching on. At the clubhouse, which was a popular club on Lafayette Square, Key was confronted by a friend who told him that he was being overly attentive to Teresa. Key got defensive and said, "This literally made me want to puke," that he had nothing but paternal feelings for her and called her a child. It gives the whole relationship an extra layer of creepiness. If you have paternal feelings for her, she's too young for you.
Yeah, and then obviously they're not paternal feelings, or they are, and it's mixed in with oh my gosh.
Yeah, no. No. This interaction and the issue with Bacon and Beekman were far too close for comfort. They were playing with fire, and neither of them wanted to be burned. They needed a private place to meet where no one would recognize or notice them. A sex house, let's be real. And luckily for Teresa, she was sleeping with her real estate agent, who knew exactly what to do. Key was going to rent them a house. He began asking around the city if anyone knew of any properties that were available. Of course, he couldn't say why he wanted the house, so he lied and told people that it was for Massachusetts Congressman Wright. There was one house that immediately came to mind. It was the John Gray House, 383 15th Street. This was attractive to him because it was affordable, $50 a month, which in today's dollars would be around $1,900 a month.
Still too expensive for me, but
right.
Hey, listen.
But it was also in a primarily Black, low-income neighborhood, which means that it's not any place he would expect to run into people he knew.
I see. And also, did anyone ask Massachusetts Congressman Wright about this?
I wondered the same thing. I hope he did well.
Yeah, kind of bizarre to throw in a real person's name,
I
right?
know. Maybe he gave the go-ahead. I doubt it, though. I think that he was just going behind his back.
Who's to say?
The house was available, so Barton signed the lease. He and Teresa finally had a secret hideaway where they could rendezvous in peace. Or so they thought. Once again, it's February 24th, 1859, about a year into the affair, and Teresa Sickles is hosting the party of the year. It's a who's who of Washington, honoring Madam James Gordon Bennett. As the night wore on, drinks and conversation were flowing. This should sound familiar. And partygoers were not ready for it to end. So Teresa and the rest of the guests, including Mr. Key, loaded up into carriages and set off for the Willard Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. As Sickles was preparing to join them, he was handed a note via messenger. Thinking nothing of it, he got into his carriage and danced the night away with his wife. After the couple got home, Teresa went to bed, and Sickles remembered the note that was sitting in his jacket pocket. He sat down and began to read. For listeners, there's some racist language in this letter, but I went ahead and took it out. Sarah, can you read this letter for us?
Sure thing. Dear Sir, with deep regret, I enclose to your address the few lines, but an indispensable duty compels me to do so, seeing that you are greatly imposed upon. There is a fellow, I may say, for he is not a gentleman by any means, by the name of Philip Barton Key, and I believe the district attorney who rents a house of a man by the name of John A. Gray on 15th Street, between K and L Street, for no other purpose than to meet your wife, Mrs. Sickles. He hangs a string out the window as a signal for her that he is in, and leaves the door unfastened, and she walks in, and sir, I do assure you, he has as much use of your wife as you have. With these few hints, I leave the rest for you to imagine. Most respectfully, your friend, RPG. Okay, do we know who RPG is?
To this day, we do not know who RPG is, which I think is crazy. It's a total mystery. But whoever the person is, their tea was piping hot and accurate.
OMG.
At first, Dan didn't know how to feel about this letter. On one hand, he had already confronted a man with a very similar story, and that man admitted to making it all up. On the other hand, this was super specific. There were details in this story, and he couldn't get them out of his head. Dan was a proud man, and the line, "He has as much the use of your wife as you have," which is crazy sexist, hate it, but I don't think that line would have sat well with Dan, being the proud man that he was. He wasn't going to confront Teresa based off of just this anonymous claim, but he wasn't ready to altogether dismiss it. He decided he would investigate and went upstairs to bed. The next day, Friday, February 25th, 1859, Sickles hit the ground running. Before heading into work, he made a quick stop at the address that was mentioned in the RPG letter and decided he'd just start poking around to see if anyone had heard anything. He was chatting it up with the neighbors, who said that they had, in fact, seen a woman going in and out of that house. Oh, and that house had just been rented, actually, to a man named Barton Key. That was all Sickles needed to hear, but he wasn't ready to accept yet that it was Teresa. He booked it to the Capitol to recruit help. That morning, the House was debating whether to reduce lawmakers' salaries until the budget was balanced, which I had to include because those conversations are still happening today. Like, if you told me that was a Chip Roy quote, I would believe you. No questions asked. Also, I learned that my mom went to high school with Chip Roy. Random anecdote. So if either of you are listening, I think my mom is a more likely listener than Chip Roy.
Right.
Hello.
Wow, I think that might be like one of the first personal details we've shared on this podcast.
Yeah, maybe we should fix that or not and remain mysterious.
Maybe I feel like we should do some type of personal intro
Yeah.
podcast, just so you know who's talking.
Well, I just love that all listeners might know about me is that my mom went to high school with Chip Roy.
And that's, what more do people need to know?
Exactly, that's everything right there. But back to Sickles. When he made it to the House of Representatives, he immediately started looking for George Woolridge, the one who confirmed Beekman's story about Teresa but didn't think it was true, who was presiding over the House floor that day. Through tears, Sickles read the RPG letter to Woolridge and shared with him the information he learned during his little recon mission that morning. He then asked Woolridge, "Will you go there and see whether or not it is true? Get a carriage, we'll go, and I'll show you the house." Woolridge agreed and they made the trip, but I thought this was funny. Sickles had to race back to the Capitol to debate the Naval Appropriations Bill. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for him to focus during the debate.
Right, like I could not care less at this point.
Exactly. Woolridge immediately began asking questions in the neighborhood, trying to confirm once and for all whether Teresa was the woman seen going in and out of the house with Key. He learned a lot of the same things that Sickles did when he canvassed the neighborhood. Key rented the home, a woman met him there 2 or 3 times a week, and this had been going on for over a month. They couldn't give a good description of the woman because she covered herself with a veil, but confirmed that she had just been there the day before, Thursday. We all need to get ourselves a friend like Woolridge because he was committed to getting the truth for Sickles. He ended up renting a room from a woman who owned a neighboring house so he could stake out the home. He filled Sickles in on all he'd learned and promised to continue the investigation the next day.
Wait, I love this guy.
Right? So the next day, on the House floor behind the speaker's chair, Sickles was ecstatic. He grabbed Woolridge. He was relieved Teresa wasn't the woman meeting Key because her whereabouts were confirmed for all day on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
So he was probably on cloud 9, like, oh my gosh, my wife is innocent. She couldn't have gone to that house with Key. The RPG letter was mistaken. I'm sure Sickles expected Woolridge to match his excitement, but he was met with an awkward silence. You see, since they last spoke, Woolridge learned that the initial report of seeing the woman at the house on Thursday was wrong.
Oh no.
She was there on Wednesday. Teresa's whereabouts couldn't be accounted for all day Wednesday. Sickles collapsed in tears. He knew it was true, and it was time to confront his wife. When he got home that evening, he went straight to his bedroom and told Teresa what he'd learned. She was sleeping with Barton Key. They met at a house on 15th Street. They had been there Wednesday at 2 p.m. She was wearing a black velvet shawl with a bugle trim. Teresa, panicked, shocked, and completely cornered, fainted. When she woke up, at her husband's demanding, she wrote the following. Sarah, can you give us one of your trademark dramatic readings? And warning for you and our listeners, this is a long one, so buckle up and get ready.
I have been in a house on 15th Street with Mr. Key. How many times, I don't know. I believe the house belongs to a black man. The house was unoccupied. Commenced going there the later part of January. Have been in alone and with Mr. Key. Usually stayed an hour or more. There was a bed in the second story. I did what is usual for a wicked woman to do. And the intimacy commenced this winter when I came from New York in that house, an intimacy of improper kind. Have met dozens of times or more at different hours of the day. On Monday of this week and Wednesday also. We arranged meetings when we first met in the street and at parties. Never would speak to him when Mr. Sickles was at home, because I knew he did not like for me to speak to him. Did not see Mr. Key for some days after I got there. He told me that he had hired the house as a place where he and I could meet. I agreed to it. I had nothing to eat or drink there. The room is warmed by wood fire. Mr. Key generally goes in first. Have walked there together, say 4 times. I do not think more. I was there on Wednesday last, between 2 and 3. Went there alone. Laura was at Mrs. Hoover's. Mr. Key took her and left her there at my request. Okay, pause. She had the man that she was cheating with drop her daughter off at the babysitter so they could hook up?
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow. I don't understand why Teresa couldn't have, at a minimum, been the one to drop Laura off. Maybe they were trying to keep up some lie that Teresa and Dan were both busy or out of town. I don't know. But then, why was Key able to bring Laura? And where were Key's kids? Lots of questions. But we have to continue with this confession, so I'll restart the music.
From there, I went to 15th Street to meet Mr. Key, and from there to the Milkwoman's. Immediately after Mr. Key left Laura at Mrs. Hoover's, I met him on 15th Street. I went in by the back gate. Went in the same bedroom, and there an improper interview was had. This occurred on Wednesday, 23rd of February, 1859. Mr. Key has kissed me in this house a number of times. I do not deny that he had a connection with this house. Last spring, a year ago, in the parlor on the sofa, Mr. Sickles is out of town, and sometimes in the capital. I think the intimacy commenced on April or May of 1858. I do not think it's safe to meet him in this house because there are servants who might suspect something. As a general thing, have worn a black and white woolen plaid dress and a beaver hat trimmed with black velvet. Have worn a black silk dress there also. Also a plaid silk dress, a black velvet coat trimmed with lace, and a black velvet shawl trimmed with fringe. On Wednesday, I either had on my brown dress or my black and white dress, a beaver hat and velvet shawl. I arranged with Mr. Key to go in the back way after leaving Laura at Mrs. Hoover's. The arrangement to go in the back was either made in the street or at Mr. Douglas's, as we would have been less likely to be seen. The house is on 15th Street between K and L, and on the left-hand side of the way. Arranged the interview for Wednesday in the street, I think on Monday, and then I went in the door and it was open, occupied in the same room. Undressed myself and he also. Went to bed together. Mr. Key has ridden in Mr. Sickles' carriages and has called at his house without Mr. Sickles' knowledge, and after my being told not to invite him to do so, and against Mr. Sickles' repeated requests.
She just lays it all out. Here's the floor
all.
plan, here's how we did it, here's what I did with our child. I also love the phrase improper interview.
Oh, totally. Also, apologies in the dramatic reading. I think I made her British at times. Neither here nor there. It's fine.
She spent some time in the UK.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, she knows Queen Elizabeth.
So she had to adopt it at some point.
Yeah. Teresa then signed the letter, saying, I won't make you read this one, Sarah. This is a true statement written by myself, without any inducement held out by Mr. Sickles of forgiveness or reward, and without any menace from him. This I have written with my bedroom door open, and my maid and child in the adjoining room at 8:30 in the evening. Miss Ridgely is in the house within call. Signed, Teresa Baggioli.
Oh,
I find it very interesting that she reverted to her maiden name to sign this letter. Witnesses, friends of Teresa's, also signed the letter. Dan asked Teresa for her wedding ring and left the room. Life as they knew it was over. Teresa sobbed herself to sleep, and Dan ruminated over the confession and intense betrayal he was feeling from the woman he loved. That's when Dan came to a conclusion. Teresa was duped and seduced by Key. Key was the reason this happened, the architect of their infidelity, and it was he who must pay. It's a very sexist line of thinking, but I also get where he's coming from because of the massive age gap. Though he was only 1 year younger than Key, so it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
The next morning, Samuel Butterworth, a fellow Tammany Hall Democrat who worked as the superintendent of the New York Assay Office. I think this is probably one of the most boring government offices to work at. It was responsible for testing the purity of American coins.
Oh no, yeah.
Arrived at the Sickles after getting a concerning message from Dan. He went upstairs, and between sobs and wails, Dan shared the entire evening's events with him, saying, quote, "I am a dishonored and ruined man and cannot look you in the face."
So dramatic.
I know. Butterworth knew exactly what to do and laid out the following plan, as written by Chris DeRose. I want to plug his book again, Star Spangled Scandal, because this episode wouldn't have been the same without it. Butterworth told Sickles to send Teresa back to New York because it was near the end of the session and no one would think it odd. Travel to Europe during the congressional recess. Arrange a separation. File for divorce. Almost no one will know the truth. This was a rather solid plan. Makes me wonder if maybe Butterworth had been around this block before? But there was a major wrinkle that Sickles pointed out. Everyone already knows. How could he be so sure? Because he had Teresa's confession, which he shakily handed over to Butterworth. They were brazen and conducted this affair in open. There were witnesses. This scandal was going to be hard to contain, if it could be at all. At the same time, Wooldridge arrived to the house, where the torrid affair was described once again. While all of this was going down, who would start pacing in front of the Sickles house but none other than Barton Key himself? Freshly shaven, completely unaware that Teresa had confessed to their affair, and ready to meet up with his mistress, Key paced back and forth in front of the Sickles home, waving a white handkerchief in the direction of Teresa's window. This was the 1800s equivalent of a "you up" text. "The villain has just passed my house," said Sickles. "I have seen the scoundrel making signals. My God, this is horrible." "Mr. Sickles, you must be calm," said Butterworth. "Look at this matter square in the face. If there be a possibility of keeping the certain knowledge of this crime from the public, you must do nothing to destroy that possibility. You may be mistaken in your belief that it is known to the whole city." No, my friend, I am not," Sickles said. "It is already the town talk." "If that be so," Butterworth said, "there is but one course left for you. And as a man of honor, you need no advice." That word, if you listen to Silly Graves, should start, putting some alarm bells in your head. Butterworth left and went to the club. Clearly, he needed a drink after this interaction. On his way, he had a brief, friendly encounter with Key on the sidewalk. Nothing but niceties, and Butterworth kept walking. Behind him came Sickles, who was beelining it straight for Key. Key extended his hand. "How are you?" he asked. "Key, you scoundrel! You have dishonored my house. You must die." "What for?" Key said. This is a very mild reaction to someone threatening your life, especially when, you know full well what you did.
Also brazen, just going, what for?
Yeah. Sickles didn't bother to answer. He pulled out his pistol and fired. He missed, and Key, finally understanding the gravity of the situation, grabbed the only thing he could, the opera binoculars that he used to see if Teresa was in the window when she waved the handkerchief, and began fighting for his life. The two wrestled in the street. Key threw his binoculars at Sickles. Sickles fired again. "Murder!" he yelled. "Don't murder me! Murder!" Sickles didn't back down. He fired another shot as he approached Key. It landed and Key fell to the ground. Then, standing over Key's body at close range, he he fired again, and again, and again, but misfired. "I am murdered," he yelled. And that he was. A crowd formed, and Key was carried to the clubhouse. And Sickles, ready to turn himself in for murder in broad daylight of the same man who, under normal circumstances, would have been the person to prosecute him. And that is where I'm going to leave you for part 1. Because let me tell you, if you think you know where this story is going, you absolutely do not. And on top of that, this case set some very important historical precedent that still impacts us to this day. And I don't want to skip over all those details and the media reaction because it's interesting. And I want to do the story justice. So stick around for part 2. Promise it won't be as long as this one.
It felt way quicker.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Next episode, we'll discuss the autopsy, which was more interesting than you'd expect. Trial, media fallout, political implications, and how this case redefined American law. But until next time, Sarah, can you gavel us out?
Absolutely. Can't wait for next time.